How does punishment change in the period 1700 to 1900? What I would like you to do first is reflect on the period 1500 to 1700. I'd like you to write a definition of each of the key forms of punishment from that period. So Bridewell, transportation and the Bloody Code. If you pause the video now for 4 minutes and give that a go. So to recap then, Bridewell was the House of Correction set up in 1556, and it was a more purposeful form of punishment that was used to punish poor people that had broken the law, where inmates would have expected to do hard labour as a way to encourage sort of better habits. Transportation was introduced in approximately 1603, and it was when convicts were sent to the American colonies as their punishment. Bloody Code was introduced in 1688 and was simply an increase in capital offences. When we're looking at changes in punishment in the period 1700 to 1900, the first change that we need to consider is the decline of the death penalty and the end of the Bloody Code. The Bloody Code reaches its peak in about 1810 when 222 crimes are punishable by death. However, not long after this particular point in time, you start to see the decline of the death penalty and the end of the Bloody Code. So why does this change take place then? Well, first of all, it's not an effective deterrent. If we think back to the Bloody Code and why it was introduced, it was to try and prevent people from committing petty crimes. However, those crimes were committed out of desperation, and therefore people were going to continue to commit those crimes regardless of the punishment. Also, you've got the change in public opinion. People are starting to think not about how to punish these poor people that are committing crimes, but also how to help them reform and change so that they don't fall back into committing the same crimes over and over again. You've also got alternative punishments such as transportation are available, so there's no need to just constantly use the capital punishment as a form of deterrent. And more importantly, the death penalty is starting to be seen as inhumane, and that alternative forms of punishment are actually better. The second change that can be seen in this period is the change in transportation from America to Australia. After 1783, as a result of the American War of Independence, England lost these colonies and prisoners could no longer be sent to America. Instead, convicts were transported to Australia, which had been claimed as part of the British Empire in 1770. Transportation was a serious punishment that was seen as an effective deterrent and a more humane alternative to the death penalty for petty crimes. Most criminals had been convicted of theft, not violent crimes. About 160,000 people were transported to Australia. About a sixth of these were women. Transportation had practical advantages too. Britain's prisons were not designed to hold the large numbers of criminals being convicted in the courts. So transportation was an alternative to building new prisons to house them. The prisoners would help to populate the new colony, which would help Britain secure its ownership. The third change in punishment we see later in this period is the end of transportation. Transportation to Australia officially ended in 1868. Changing attitudes in both Britain and Australia help explain this particular change. In Australia, many people believe that ex-convicts were responsible for high crime levels in some Australian towns. And free settlers argued that convict workers meant there were fewer jobs for others and that employers were able to pay lower wages overall. In Britain, some British campaigners said conditions on the convict ships were inhumane, and some even argued that actually transportation as a punishment was too lenient. Australia was also becoming a desirable place to settle, especially after gold was discovered, so transportation became less of a deterrent as people were actually wanting to go and live there. People were also concerned about the costs of running the prison colony in Australia. And we also have new ideas about prison emerging that actually meant there were new prisons being built in Britain and therefore less of a need for transportation. The fourth change to consider when we're looking at punishment in this period is the end of public executions. The main reason why public executions were ended in 1868 was because they weren't an effective deterrent. People were still committing the same crimes even though they were watching criminals be executed for them. A further reason why public executions were ended was because actually they attracted large crowds in almost a carnival-style atmosphere. This creates two further problems. It allows opportunities for more crime, such as pickpocketing and prostitution, and makes it very difficult and expensive for the police to control. We've also got high-profile individuals such as Charles Dickens, who started to openly criticise the use of public executions as being inhumane. And because of that, you've got a change in the general population in terms of how they view public executions. We start to see a change in attitudes in terms of moving away from a deterrent and perhaps more towards rehabilitation in this period. Sometimes the convict was also treated as a hero, obviously suggesting that this idea of public execution as a deterrent was not effective whatsoever. And the fact that people used to go and watch and quite enjoy it, again, shows that it was ineffective as a deterrent. So ultimately, it was ended in 1868. The fifth and final change to punishment in this period is the increased use of prisons. As previously discussed, the decline of the Bloody Code and concerns about transportation made prisons seem a more suitable alternative. The purpose of punishment seemed to be debatable at this particular point in time. Some people believe that it should allow opportunities for rehabilitation. Others believe that it should act as a strong deterrent to others. That should involve hard work to pay back society, some element of retribution there as well. There's also the idea that it should make society safer by separating criminals from everyone else. In the picture on the slide, you can see an example of hard labour that would have been a feature of prison system at this particular point in time. This is called the tread wheel, and the prisoner walked up the wheel for 10 minutes at a time with a 5-minute break before the next 10-minute stint. This went on for 8 hours a day, and prisoners climbed an equivalent of over 2.5 kilometres in every shift. Prisoners stood in separate booths at the wheel to ensure there was no communication between them. So you can see that this obviously is a strong deterrent that was used within the prison system itself. Okay, so I'd like you to apply the knowledge to completing the following sentences now. The death penalty declined in the 19th century because transportation changed in the 18th century because transportation ended in the 19th century because public execution ended in 1868 because the use of prisons changed in the 19th century because the main purpose of punishment in the period 1700-1900 was punishment in the period 1500-1700s and 1700 and 1900s is similar because. I'd like you to pause the video for 4 minutes now. I'd like you to think about how you would complete those sentences. Okay, in terms of the death penalty declined in the 19th century because you could have something along the lines of it's not an effective deterrent, public opinion was changing to focus more on the idea of reform, or there was alternative punishments that could be used at this point. Transportation changed in the 18th century because America won the War of Independence, which meant that America no longer was a British colony, so convicts were sent to Australia from this point in time onwards. Transportation ended in the 19th century because Australia was becoming more desirable as it found gold there. The cost of running the prison colony was expensive, and Australians began to blame an increased crime rate on the convicts that were being sent there. Public execution ended in 1868 because it wasn't an effective deterrent and it was increasingly being seen as inhumane. The use of prisons changed in the 19th century because of the end of transportation and the decline of the death penalty. We need to see an alternative form of punishment, and that's why we'll see the increased use of prisons in this period. The main purpose of punishment in the period 1700-1900 was to deter. However, you can see increasingly more a move towards rehabilitation in this period. Punishment in the period 1500-1700s and the 1700s-1900s is similar because the main purpose is to deter in both periods. Now it's time to apply this knowledge to an exam question. So explain one-way transportation was different in the 17th century and the 19th century. It's 4 marks, so again a reminder that there shouldn't be a long response, it should be a small paragraph. The first 2 marks come from identifying the difference in this case of transportation between the 2 periods, and then you must give a specific example from each time period to highlight, demonstrate the difference that you have identified. I'd like you to pause the video now for 5 minutes, and I'd like you to give this exam question a go. I'm just going to read you a model answer now. So one-way transportation was different in the 17th century and the 19th century was because of the location that criminals were sent. So you've straight away identified the difference between transportation in those 2 periods. So there, in that blue sentence would give you the first 2 marks. In the 17th century, King James I sent criminals to work in newfound colonies in North America. Okay, so there's your specific example of where transportation took place in the 17th century. So there's your 3rd mark. However, in 1783, America had declared their independence. So from that point on, convicts were sent to Australia instead. Okay, so there, that pink sentence is your specific example from the 19th century. And it highlights the difference that you've identified. So that would be the 4th mark.